Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about the book Occult Feminism by Rachel Wilson. As with the previous book in this series and all books after this, we'll be going through a general overview of the key points presented, expanding where needed, and discussing what is interesting. Introduction. This book is broadly critical of feminism and points out its occult or religious roots. This is of course of interest to me as my ongoing project shares the same aim, so seeing how my contemporaries undertake a similar task is obviously going to be of interest. As a book it is quite short and to the point, however owing to its lightness it is lacking in some of the finer details, and doesn't expand upon points that really should have been. There are even specific points where the author will hand-wave certain sources rather than expanding upon them, as if mentioning something is critique enough without further elaboration. Examples will follow shortly. The book is generally interesting, and has certainly given a few more names to look into, and helped indicate a timeline of some of the players involved, which is helpful. For me, however, the book treads a lot of old ground, and covers things that are already known. I'd still say it's helpful for people less in the know of the topic, and still worth a look, if you're just getting into the topic of feminism and its religious and spiritual underpinnings. The author of the book is an Orthodox Christian. This worldview heavily biases certain parts of the book, which contains several unnecessary swings at Protestant Christianity and several other denominations, going so far as to unprovokedly refer to it as similar to Satanism in its focus on individualism. Throughout the book there are several moments that can best be described as satanic panic, where the author needlessly asserts things are satanic or demonic for no other reason than her own obvious religious bias. This will make certain areas of the book confusing for people, because there is legitimate Luciferian links to specific areas of the occult that some feminists and proto-feminists have dabbled in. However, throwing the "this is satanic" label around far more than is warranted works heavily against this book, especially casually dropping in phrases such as paganism and Satanism, as if these two things are the same. Indigenous Proto-Indo-European pre-Christian practices were objectively not satanic. It had no concept of Satan. That is a Christian invention. Moments like this speak more to an ignorance on the part of the author of pre-Christian European beliefs and practices. Throughout this write-up I will attempt to correct some of this misinformation. This does not invalidate other points made in the book. Parts looking at the timeline of characters within the women's rights and feminist movements are well done, as are the parts looking at how expansive and influential this has been throughout time and society, up to and including at the governmental level. The parts containing misinformation about paganism is merely something to be observed and aware of, as these are opinions that can be simply ignored while still being able to take in the factual parts of the book. For a note here and a potential olive branch, I might be tempted to suggest that this author's misunderstanding of Proto-Indo-European belief systems stems from the feminist New Age bastardization of these ideas, and it might be more proper to read the word pagan in this book as neo-pagan, as a means of separating these modern forms of paganism from Proto-Indo-European metaphysics. This is something the author could have expanded upon and corrected, but didn't because of her Orthodox Christian bias. Unfortunately, the orthodox views of the author also leads to ignoring crucial points regarding Christianity, especially during the final chapter, which is little more than a "just accept Jesus and all this goes away" sermon. There are assertions throughout the book that Orthodox Christianity wouldn't allow for or fall to the occult beliefs of feminism, nor would it allow itself to be influenced or infiltrated by such politically motivated forces. Unfortunately, this ignores the fact that this did happen in order for Catholicism, Protestantism, etc. to rise in the first place. There are also other criticisms of all forms of Christianity from the likes of Nietzsche, that involve the observation that, by its own structure, Christianity loans itself perfectly to be overtaken by socialism and communism, because of doctrines of every man is born equal, everyone is equal before God, everyone is equal within God, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, etc. That specific verse has been used to help in the creation of various cults around the Age of Aquarius, which the author touches on in this book, and I will expand upon it later. But the author specifically avoids mentioning that this is a flaw inherent to Christianity. This equalitarian rhetoric is easily exploitable by movements for their own ends. Expanding further on this, there is the observation, also from Nietzsche, of Christianity's slave morality, the acceptance and glorification of tolerance in turning the other cheek, blessed are the peacemakers, and the lionization of weakness of the meek shall inherit the earth, and everyone being my brother in Christ, in spite of any other differences those people may have. This inherently puts Christianity in the position of having no ability to defend itself or its people from outside forces or more insidious forms of infiltration. To those who would wish to argue against this by referencing Christian military campaigns such as the Crusades, this must be seen in light of a several hundred-year conversion away from pagan beliefs, which extolled virtues of strength and the importance of kith and kin, and how many of these traits, beliefs, and yes, even gods, continued their influence despite Christian conversion, with many pagan gods becoming saints of the church or being humorized into mere humans, so as to undermine the importance of pagan kings being descended directly from Woden. Christians even went so far as to falsify records to prove Woden was a descendant of Noah, in a pitiable attempt to undermine the importance of this tradition. In the 1000 to 1400s, these crusades would be more akin to culturally pagan peoples living by those values with a veneer of Christianity that would only become thicker over time. Let us not forget, after the Crusades in the Middle East, many so-called Christians were put to death for not worshipping Christ, despite their supposed fighting for Christendom. To further and perhaps overhammer this point, pagans didn't convert to Christianity and suddenly become moral and correct-thinking people after being dunked in magical water, a practice which is actually pagan in itself because of sacred wells and water being a transitional point between this world and the other world. No, this framework, these moral standards and thoughts already existed within the people. Christians lie about certain things in paganism to make it seem worse and frequently more demonic or satanic than it actually is, such as the nature of human sacrifices in pre-Christian Europeans, as if this was a very common thing. It was not, and when it did happen was frequently either killing captives of war, which Christians also did, frequently in more brutal and torturous ways like crucifixion, or was undertaken voluntarily. To demonstrate how this never changed, even with Christianity and its so-called superior morals, there was an old pre-Christian tradition of burying skulls of animals under houses, usually under doorways or fireplaces, which are liminal spaces, to help ward against evil spirits. Commonly, this would be done by burying a horse head, but could sometimes be an entire horse skeleton. This is part of the origin of hanging a horseshoe over the top of a door. Horses are believed to be excellent at identifying spirits, and so burying a dead one, or parts of a dead one, would convey that ability to the other world to cast protection over a certain area. Did you know that there are numerous Christian churches that not only did this with animals, but also with human beings? Saint Oran or Audrain, as but one example, attempted to build a church on the Isle of Iona in Scotland. A divine voice, allegedly, called to him claiming that the walls of the church would not stand a single year without his sacrifice. To this end, he was entombed alive beneath the church as it was built. Supposedly, sometime after this human sacrifice, the body of Audran lifted its head out of the ground and said, "There is no hell as you suppose, nor heaven that people talk about." Alarmed by this, workers who were building the chapel quickly had the body removed and reburied in consecrated ground, or in other versions of the story, simply called for more earth to cover the talking corpse. This is yet another example of Christians enacting pagan morality, and shows that conversion did not civilize the savage as Christians would have you think. Rather, Christianity has, once again, adopted pagan culture as its own. Lest we forget, many martyrs, and Christ himself, also sacrificed themselves. This is human sacrifice, suddenly stated, as not barbaric and backward, but good, noble, and righteous. I could expand this point further to point out the frequent use of pagan motifs, such as the Green Man, a pagan god of nature having carvings visible in pretty much every centuries-old church in the UK. Even the inclusion of gargoyles and grotesques on churches were frequently allusions to brownies, boggarts, boggles, hobs, goblins, gnomes, fae, and other pre-Christian folklore magical house spirits. I could even make observations regarding civilizations such as the Roman Empire's fall coinciding with the uptake of Christianity. But I think I've made my point. Religion is not the basis of morals. Religion is merely the codification of existing morals within a population that is accepted by the plurality of individuals that create it. It is, at its base, merely the fairy tale, the common fable, the founding myth that makes its precepts easy to understand and digest, and makes the system of morality, slightly ironically perhaps, occult, easier to understand the meaning of, with less thought and introspection for those outside the inner circle of knowledge. On top of that, it creates community ties and bonds with the use of ritual and rite, and thus creates a strong us to face the rest of the world, that is, the them. This is very useful in a society that is fragmented, increasingly so in these days. However, this does not remove the fact that religion is a tool of morality, not its basis. To believe one must be religious to be moral requires you to place the cart before the horse, and believe that religion causes human behavior, rather than religion being manifested by human behavior. Even in the feedback loop of religion influencing behavior, the behavior must first manifest in order to be influenced. After several hundred years of just Christianity in the West, and we can see and safely state that we are in the position we are in with this occult feminist takeover of our culture because of Christianity, not in spite of it. There is also the historic fact that Gnostic beliefs, which inform much of the occult side of feminism and intersectionality, grew out of Christianity, because Christianity is itself Gnostic, because of the requirement of attaining gnosis or knowledge of Christ, so one can ascend or transcend to heaven after death or during the rapture. See the forever question regarding conversion of the unknowing, with some stating all people go to hell without Christ, while others believe that people who have not heard the good news and understood the way cannot go to heaven or hell because of their total ignorance, which leads to an interesting scenario where missionaries are condemning everyone to hell by merely informing them of Christ. To this end, I would also like to suggest that if your religion uses threat of eternal torture to gain your acceptance and submission, then it's very questionable how much those people genuinely believe and love your God. You can, after all, get people to say and do pretty much anything under threat of violence, torture, and death. The fact that Christianity has been taken over by these beliefs is proof that it can be taken over by such beliefs. No amount of, if people only did things this way, will change that objective fact. This leaves the author of this book in the uncomfortable position of effectively only being able to state, if only everyone thought the same way I do, then this wouldn't happen. Which is true, but not in any way helpful, as this could be said to be true for pretty much any position. Other than the obvious bias in favor of the author's particular flavor of religion, the rest of the timeline of information, collation of names and references to books and papers, is in general quite good, if a little sparse in places where it really could have done with being expanded upon. However, for a book that appears to be self-published, we usually have to expect lower standards, and thus judge it by those. It should be noted this is not necessarily a criticism of this tome, but merely an observation of the current structure of publishing. As this book itself notes repeatedly and correctly, our culture is steeped in feminist rhetoric and knowledge, it penetrating unseen and unknown into numerous aspects of society and culture. This makes critiquing feminism a consistent uphill battle, because it results in having to not only touch, but in some cases openly slaughter, rip open and scatter the viscera of society's sacred cows on the ground before you for all to see. This understandably results in a less than welcoming reception. See people such as myself over the years being slandered as haters of women who just want the female sex to live lives as submissive, breedable sows, chained up barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen until the day they can no longer ovulate, at which point they must be killed and replaced with younger, even more submissive and breedable broodmares. This is, of course, the opposite of reality. The tradcon 1950s fantasy that never really existed anyway has always been a site of criticism for people such as myself as well, but reality be damned for those whose minds have been rotted into only being able to think in 140-character sound bites. After all, if you are not a feminist, then you are a sexist. With these sorts of things in mind, it is no wonder a book such as this could not be printed via a mainstream publishing house. Despite its flaws, some of which are deliberate because of religious bias, and despite how hard I've gone on it in this opening because of that bias, I am actually broadly more positively disposed towards this book than negative, and still grateful for its existence and the help it has offered in my own writing and research. I commend the effort that was put into bringing it to fruition. Chapter 1. On page 8, the author states that she believes feminism aims to deify women and make them as gods over men. This is something which I loosely agree with, but with caveats that I think this might be a view of only some feminists. Here I'm thinking of the varying circles of knowledge you find in many cults, specifically core, inner, and outer. I've mentioned before in this overarching project and discussions I've had about it that I consider pointing out the objective truth of feminism's religious origins to be, in some ways, a pointless endeavour that should be undertaken for love of knowledge rather than for use on the everyday rank-and-file believer, for no other reason than many of the religious adherents are neophytes of the faith. If you point out to a feminist that they hold spiritual beliefs, they will frequently recoil at the idea and tell you to educate yourself and read a book. This is because you, as the person demonstrating the religious origins, are, in reality, more informed and have read more books on the topic than they have. This leads us back to the point of deifying women over men. I don't doubt that many feminists believe this, but I think that at the fundament of the religion of feminism is the transcendent belief in returning all souls to Source, to Gaia, to God, to the Oversoul, etc. It is not about elevating women to godhood over men, it is about turning humans into the one God, Source, Oversoul. This has been covered before in previous write-ups and conversations. Note, I'm not saying the women as gods over men is wrong. It certainly isn't for some number of feminists. I merely think that this is true for the outer circle of the religion's neophyte cadre of rabid radical man-hating, possibly also politically lesbian women. Also men who are into the idea of woman worship for their own possibly fetishistic reasons. On page 9, the author mentions the belief feminism holds towards Christianity and some other religions as being patriarchal and run by men. This helped to spur them towards other forms of spiritualism and religions that included goddesses and the ability for women to fill religious roles as spiritualists, psychics, mediums, etc. This is true, we've mentioned this before. The author mentions occult symbolism, specifically here tongues out of mouths being tied to the female deity Kali, and the use of mirrored faces of deities such as Janus being related to scrying magic. This is true, these symbols do have these ties, and it is very interesting that early feminist publications, such as Ms. Magazine, would choose to make use of a tongue-out Kali on their first issue. However, this is something that must be approached with caution, and I say this while largely in agreement with the spiritualist connections the author makes here, and wish to simply mention this in the abstract, away from this particular book, which I think makes strong enough cases for these occult symbol links to stand on their own. In the same way that there are actual conspiracy theories regarding pieces of artwork featuring a person with one eye covered being a symbol of Illuminati involvement, or spiral triangles being indicative of paedophilia. There are times where this may be the case, in specific religious circumstances or organizations. However, getting out into wider society, it is more likely that these are just things that are done by people unknowing of any connotation of the symbols. For example, the previously mentioned paedophile spiral triangle symbol could indicate that some higher up at a company like Disney keeps walking into the art department and demanding they put that symbol in all of their movies for no particular reason, but it really needs to be there. Or it's simply that spirals and their various subtypes are a common cross-cultural symbol that is easy to draw, familiar to everyone, and simply filling in space on what would otherwise be a plain background, or add some manner of texture to something where a totally flat surface may look odd or out of place. See examples of so-called greebles and panelization in entertainment franchises such as Star Wars or Star Trek. Putting panels, tubes, wires, mesh, etc. on a wall makes it look complicated and also more real than a flat wall. Even though if you look into modern ships, even military vessels that have little need to hide tubes and wires from the general public, you will never see this level of stuff on a wall. It is merely a way of making things look interesting and being more fantastical. As such, seeing small symbols or things that look like symbols must be approached with caution. Misidentifying or misattributing something will, overall, harm the credibility of those making the accusation, and thus it must be treated with care, especially in the face of movements that actively look to discredit detractors as a means of silencing them. This is all to say that the occult symbolism being used is interesting and certainly worth noting. However, we also have to consider fashions and trends of the era. For example, part of the reason Theosophy became popular was because there was a glut of new archaeological findings being made in places like the Middle East, and exposure to Asian religions and cultures, such as those found in India, sparked a cultural interest in these new ideas, fashions, religions, etc. There is a reason why Theosophy frequently makes use of ankhs, swastikas, jeds, the Om, and winged sun images. These were seen at the time as being exotic symbols from faraway unknown religions that became very fashionable to have interest in and want to study in the upper, well-travelled and thus wealthy classes. Put simply, we must always be aware of how much of this is being displayed or talked about with sincerity versus how much is done just to be seen as being in with the latest high society fashions and interests. For example, later in the book the author mentions the deliberate invocation of Lucifer by proto-feminists. Is this because they are invoking the devil, or are they just doing it to be edgy and counterculture to a dominant Christian society? There's making the use of symbols because you genuinely believe in those symbols and what they do, and you're doing it for that religious purpose. Then there's just using symbols that people don't like because they don't like them and you want to cause offense. You can make the case that this doesn't matter hugely, either way it works in a countercultural and thus subversive and undermining fashion, but I think it's important to be aware of this in a similar manner to how we discussed before, inner circle and outer circle of the faith, or people who are just doing things to be edgy. Or even people who are just using symbols because the symbols themselves are memes that they have zero understanding of. They simply replicate something with no understanding. For an ultra-modern example that happened during the scripting of this video, Greta Thunberg, the climate activist, found herself in hot water after publishing a pro-Palestine image in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The controversy happened in part because of her endorsement of a side in this political conflict, but far larger because her photograph featured a small blue stuffed octopus toy. During the events of World War II, there were various pieces of anti-Semitic agitprop produced in Nazi Germany that depicted Jews as an octopus, usually blue in color, with long tentacles reaching around the world and sneaking into every aspect of industry, business, and daily life. Was this an anti-Semitic dog whistle using an occult symbol, or was it just a children's stuffed toy? You can make arguments for both. the impromptu nature of the photo resulting in a mere unfortunate coincidence, or the fact that Greta is a highly controlled individual, and even the most girl-next-door looking people on social media are not free to do as they please, and even the most relaxed, candid, and totally natural, in no way scripted at all photos of them are all highly choreographed events, featuring numerous makeup, wardrobe, lighting, body language people, and yes, set designers and prop masters. Both of these things can be potential explanations that may or may not be true. To give Christian examples that may be relevant to the author of the book, the cross itself is a solar wheel symbol, representing the solar and/or sky father, and was used this way for millennia before it was used as a symbol for Christ. Christians have forgotten or never knew the value of this symbol and perpetuated its use for something unrelated. This is compounded and made even more interesting by the fact that Christianity is not a solar active masculine religion, but a lunar reflective feminine religion as defined by Evola. The ichthys fish symbol is a pre-Christian symbol of Atargatis, and is a symbol relating to the womb and fertility. Christians again perpetuate this symbol, seemingly without knowing what it means, or thinking it means something else. The fish and water motif of Christianity also relates to the New Age concept of the Age of Aquarius, which is a New Age Gnostic date related to the spiritual rebirth of Christ in the ethereal world. This ties into topics we've covered previously regarding the development of human psychic abilities and the ability to alter vibrational frequencies to ascend to a higher plane of existence. We will also mention this in more detail later. This was documented extensively by the likes of Rudolf Steiner, who is a fascinating character in his own right. He's yet another Hegelian who became associated with the Nazis and had some fascinating views regarding the use of vaccinations to destroy the soul, and to vaccinate the just born against the development of a soul or spiritual awareness. This would create a case of, as we've discussed before, separating the soul from the body, and all the importance that that belief holds. Just a reminder, this belief grew out of Christianity because it is rooted in the dualism of Christianity. Even the entire construction of church and church ceremony is based on pagan beliefs, most likely Anglo-Saxon paganism. Pagan temples had a congregation area facing an altar, which was decorated with a white cloth, with altarware that would frequently be made of precious metals. There were libations, liquids for blessings and offerings to the gods, along with foods, in many cases wine or blood and bread. Literally, the only difference between a Christian church ceremony and a pagan temple ceremony is swapping out the name of the god you're aiming the proceedings at, with a few hundred years of evolution. Yet no one would say Christianity is pagan, with the two being inseparable, and all Christian symbols representing the pagan things they were borrowed from, or stolen from, if you want to be more inflammatory. Returning to the book, the Kali connection is still interesting. As the author notes Kali's desire for the sacrifice of men. My note next to this is referencing the old feminist joke, going to find out if this is a girl or an abortion, in relation to finding themselves pregnant. On page 17, the author notes the solitary practitioner means of witchcraft and Wicca, and how this appeals to women looking to separate from patriarchal religions into something anti-hierarchy, anti-structure, etc. I have notes in this questioning if this could perhaps, therefore, view some people turning to this as a form of socialist praxis, because it hits a lot of the same beats. This is also in light of the next page mentioning of Susanna, who was a founding member of Susan B. Anthony Coven No. 1, which is the USA's first female-only witch coven. Zed mentions that she thinks religion is the highest form of politics, and goes so far as to state that feminism needs a spiritual dimension. The founder of a branch of Wicca says witchcraft and feminism goes hand in hand. This also leads us to WITCH, which is a feminist and explicitly socialist organization, but we'll talk about that later. Chapter 2. The opening of Chapter 2 notes the use of standpoint theory, and how this allows feminist academics to effectively change history using mental gymnastics, because from the standpoint of any particular person, you can justify any manner of interpretation. I have notes regarding this and wish to expand upon it much further than the author does. The standpoint theory observation is correct, but we can expand this out further, referencing back to Schaef 1982 and Women's Reality. We remember that objectivity and attempting to define and categorize things as being white male system thinking. This is the same chord being struck twice, and helps unveil it as a core tenet of the feminist religion. Objectivity does not exist in the female system. Never forget, women delight in paradox and love giving up mental and physical control to revel in contradiction. This also ties to the concept of her story, the bastardization of history, under the falsity that the term history comes from his story, not the Greek word historia, meaning to learn from, inquire about, acquire knowledge by investigation, etc. Her story is specifically defined as history written from a feminist perspective, and emphasizing the role of women, or told from a woman's point of view. Interestingly, the term her story was first written about in the book Sisterhood is Powerful by Robin Morgan, in which she talks about a feminist organization called WITCH, Witch, and writes the following. Quote, "The fluidity and wit of the witches is evident in the ever-changing acronym. The basic original title was Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and the latest heard at this writing is Women Inspired to Commit Her Story." End quote. Which also went on to refer to themselves as women inspired to tell their collective history. The importance of the female perspective, female understanding, and female system is very much on show, even in the fact that they have no fixed name, and thus cannot be objectively labelled or defined. Such is the power of female system thinking, which is process, ongoing and forever, until the imminentist end of history. I should note the author doesn't mention the feminist organization Witch throughout this book, which I think is a missed opportunity, given that she does mention Dianic Wicca, which is something that Witch is heavily influenced by. Of note about Witch, they are also openly socialists and attribute female oppression to capitalism. Something else regarding which, this ties me to previous points about inner circle and outer circle knowledge, and needing to be careful with judging sincerity of people using occult symbols. They have also claimed their acronym stands for Women Interested in Toppling Consumer Holidays. Probably a socialist sentiment, but in another circumstance could easily be seen as a silly socialist satire joke from the likes of Monty Python. I think in this circumstance there's more than enough proof to indicate that Witch is genuinely a Dianic Wiccan coven that actually are socialist feminists, but it's just something to be aware of. After this, the author goes on to mention the historic fact of women owning property, signing contracts, and voting. These are all true, and we've covered them before. She mentions genetic bottlenecks in human history that reveals times where much smaller numbers of men than women reproduced. This is also true, but the author's phrasing is inaccurate. She phrases it as only 40% of men who have ever lived being successful in passing on their genetic material by reproduction compared to 80% of women. This is an oversimplification of the maths, and is an average that is thus non-representative. The whole having twice the number of female ancestors to male comes as a result of a series of bottlenecks, not an average of one man to one woman reproducing over all time. For example, if you look at the study Recent Bottleneck of Y Chromosome Diversity Coincides with a Global Change in Culture by Carmen et al., During the Neolithic period, the reproductive ratio skewed to a massive 17:1 female to male ratio. In fact, in the same study, the graph shows the average data suggests more of a 3:1 ratio than Wilson suggested 2:1 in this book. But this 3:1 ratio is coming from Neolithic reproduction, so it's possible the 3:1 ratio has skewed down to a 2:1 average, but again we need to pay attention to bottlenecks and averages and make sure the maths lines up for these claims. For more information on this, you can watch Biology, Culture, Ideology by Coltane and Neolithic Reproduction, Agriculture, and the Mechanization Effect by Stardusk. These will give you more information on these bottlenecks and genetic drifts than I'm going to cover in this write-up, because it is a lengthy topic. However, I would here like to note this ties very strongly to claims I've made before regarding uncomfortable truths regarding female behavior that tradcons cannot answer. That is, the behavior we're seeing now and decrying in women is how they have always been. There have simply been hard natural law rules preventing or limiting certain facets of behavior like hypergamy, multiple partner taking, etc. To those who would like to state hypergamy don't reals, the answer to this is the question, do women exhibit any preference in who they sleep with, or are they open to all offers equally? If the answer is yes, they exhibit preferences, which they self-evidently do, you really shouldn't need peer-reviewed published information to know this, but it can be provided if you really want to make a statement that stupid. Then we can qualify and quantify those revealed preferences, which universally gives us a pattern of mate preference that is equal to or above their own level of social status and resource provision, with specific studies showing women are willing to trade other preferred things, such as height, for more resources. The advent of hormonal birth control has removed that hard natural law limit of sex makes babies, and thus you see the underlying human-ape behavior writ large in this new environment. It would seem to me that it was not feminism that did this to women. It is simply that women were always like this and had natural law limitations on their behavior, which could be socially reinforced, often by other women. Once that law is broken, ironically by men wanting to provide for women, in this case by providing hormonal birth control so they can have everything they want and be happy, well, here we are. To once again overhammer the point, if a population collapses and is repopulated by a population whose females are A-OK with a 17:1 female to male breeding ratio, what does that say for the descendants of such an animal? Remember, successful patterns propagate themselves. This is the basis of evolution, and once again points to the uncomfortable fact women were always like that. It's most telling that feminism didn't arise at any point in human history before the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and thus mass, safe, frequently climate-controlled work conditions, and the advent of hormonal birth control. Almost as if separating sex from reproduction and allowing women safe, easy access to work outside the home, because it's now climate-controlled and semi-automated, is the cause of this movement, not the other way around. Feminism is the reaction, not the reagent. The author mentions chivalry and how it is a code for knights and not romantic or in regards to treatment of women. This is true. Chivalry comes from the French chevalier, which is a knight. The author doesn't seem to mention this origin and translation, which is odd, but okay. Just another example of something that could have been expanded upon and wasn't. On page 24 through 26, the author talks about witchcraft and how some of the persecution is linked to herbalism and its use in things like abortion. This led to Christianity persecuting herbalists as witches. However, the author claims it is disingenuous to call this persecution as a result of knuckle-dragging ignorant Christians, and she ultimately supports the aim, if not the method, because of her obvious religious bias. I, on the other hand, find it hard to not see this as knuckle-dragging ignorant Christians turning their back on local folk knowledge that held purpose because of a foreign imported religion. The author once again casually throws paganism in with Satanism because of religious bias. Satanism is a Christian concept, not a pagan one. Satanism and the idea of eternal punishment as default is incongruent with the pre-Christian beliefs of Europe. Casually lumping these things together speaks of a level of, frankly, ignorance of pre-Christian belief systems, including mentioning things like sex magic and orgies, which were not the norm in pre-Christian Europe. Unsurprisingly, these people had rituals for marriage, and lineage is beyond important to pre-Christians, hence the need for pre-Christian rulers to demonstrate descendants from Woden as part of their proof of divine right to rule. Ancestors and gods are one and the same in this belief system. This system cannot work if sex magic orgies are the norm, or even broadly supported. This is unfortunately fairly typical Christian misinformation or ignorance on the topic. Again, I emphasize the fact that people did not do this for centuries and then suddenly convert and upend their lifestyle and cultural norms. Marriages of one man, one woman, and extended nuclear families were the norm before Christianity showed up in Europe, and continued to be the norm after Christianity showed up. After this, the author lists many women that demonstrate the inaccuracy of feminist agitprop regarding women's place in history. Mary Wollstonecraft, who became seen as an Enlightenment intellectual, and her numerous affairs and pregnancy as she travelled around Europe writing and having numerous affairs with men, and yet never being forced back into the kitchen. Wollstonecraft seems to be one of the proto-feminists, angry at women being happy having a place in the world doing things she considered to be silly, such as home industry. On page 28, the author reminds us she is orthodox with some historical revisionism regarding Christianity. At this point, I'm slightly annoyed she keeps doing this and that I have to keep veering into pointing out Christianity's history and errs in a write-up about feminism and its spiritualist origins. But this is the religious bias of the author at work. The parts of the book not about Christianity are good, I want to emphasize that, but then this sort of thing keeps happening. She mentions the Protestant Reformation and Roman Catholic schism as being wrecking balls to Christianity, and claims there was a unified Christian church for a millennium before this. This is factually wrong. The Gnostic movement began in the 2nd century because it is heavily influenced by the Old Testament Jewish writings. Because Christianity is, at fundament, a Jewish cult, that is the intellectual and spiritual origin of the concept of the Messiah. Orthodox Christianity actually grew out of one of a great many Judeo-Christian cults, many of which would later be described as heresies by the victors of these many schisms. There was the rise of the Docetist, the idea that Christ had no physical form and was illusory, or a form of hallucinogenic miracle from God for his followers. There was a quasi-Pentecostal movement in Phrygia, which was basically a Christian immanentist doomsday cult, and I use the word immanentist there with purpose given our previous discussions about Gnosticism and the Marxist end of history. This has always been a part of the Christian canon. The very fact that non-Trinitarianism was a thing, this is the belief that not all parts of the Trinity are divine or even exist in the form of adoptionism, the idea Christ was not born divine but merely adopted by God as opposed to being born of God. Monarchianism, that believes the 3 parts of the Godhead are indivisible, and this required the councils of Nicaea in 325 AD, Constantinople in 381 AD, and Ephesus in 431 AD to root out. This shows us plainly and clearly there never was one unified Orthodox Church, let alone one true pure one which stood for a millennium before those evil Protestants came around for no other reason at all than being satanic. Regrettably, the remainder of Chapter 2, in which the author complains about every sect of Christianity not being real Christians, can be written off as simply the author being orthodox and repeated no true Scotsman fallacies based on lack of historical knowledge regarding Christianity and heavy religious bias. Yes, Christianity evolved during the Enlightenment, and some of the more dominant strains of that cult fractured. This is merely a natural evolution of a belief system. And yes, some of it did evolve into a more Gnostic form of occultism. But this must be seen for what it is, a natural outgrowth of a Christianity that was never unified. Chapter 3. The start of Chapter 3 gives a rundown of various Christian sects that moved to America from Europe. Even if it does contain many slights and downright insults towards them because of the author's own biases, this is still an accurate assessment. The author does mention, crucially, something that is true. That is, the deism of Protestant Enlightenment thinkers led us to what would now be called the scientific method. Deism holds the belief that God created the universe with a comprehensible, rational set of rules, or laws. This is further expanded to state that God does not directly intervene in human affairs through miracle or revelation. These two things taken together give us the basis for science, the idea that there are rules to the universe, some manner of overarching order. On page 33, the author mentions that people are surprised America became more progressive over time, and states this should not be a surprise because America was founded by progressives in the form of its myriad sects of Christians that were not orthodox. I have issues with this because even though a lot of progressive movements have grown out of these Christian and occult sects, it ignores key developments outside of theology, and also doesn't explain how and why these things have only arisen in the last century, post-industrial revolution, and post-hormonal birth control. For example, rampant promiscuity and crashing birth rates is far better explained by hormonal birth control and the base biology of humans interacting with this stimulus than obscure occult beliefs for most people. I say this as someone who agrees that the occult spiritualist side of feminism has had influence on society and is deeply entwined with the history of the movement. But once again, I think we run up against inner and outer circle knowledge and understanding. I'm of the belief that much of this spiritual and occult side of things is very inner circle, and thus not known to the majority of people within the feminist cult, whereas this author seems to think the spiritualist and occult side is more diffuse. It may be a difference in thought, or just my interpretation of what I'm reading. On page 35, the author mentions John Noyes, someone credited with the invention of free love and the concept of the New Age from 1831 onwards. This came about because of his belief that the second coming of Christ had already happened, and thus we were living in a new age of heaven on earth, if only humans could be perfected and become free of sin. Noyes ended up creating a free love cult based on belief that the Bible didn't specify marriage as one man, one woman. This cult practiced eugenics as a means of attempting to breed a spiritually superior humanity, and believed in the communal raising of children. You find this a lot in various Judeo-Christian cults and their offshoots, including early versions of Israeli kibbutz, which once again shows you the connection. It's also interesting that this community practiced a form of eugenics under the title stirpiculture, differentiated from actual eugenics because of its radical religious influence. This is interesting because of things mentioned in previous talks regarding how various Hegelian thinkers, such as Heidegger and Steiner, led to German idealism. I always find it amusing that feminists call everyone they don't like a Nazi, while their intellectual and spiritual canon's history is directly responsible for various ideas that Nazis took up. It should be noted that many feminists will still praise Noyes and his Oneida cult for their supposedly pro-feminist ideals because of their methods of dealing with marriage, and also their insistence on women wearing trousers and working just like men. On pages 36 through 38, the author mentions Margaret Fuller and her connection to George and Dana Ripley, and covers the history of Unitarianism and their Gnostic belief in the Oversoul. This is true, we've mentioned it enough before. Of course, the author claims Unitarians are not Christian, despite the fact that they are, but we've covered this bias enough already. On page 39, the author commits far and away the worst example of sin of glossing over something in this book. When talking about Sophia Ripley and her essay Woman, the author simply derides it as being transcendentalist nonsense and ends this denigration with the one-word sentence, yawn. Apart from being unprofessional and sounding like a pseudo-intellectual Twitter critic, this would have been the perfect place to actually address the essay in question with direct quotes. However, because the author is orthodox, she will seemingly refuse to read what she calls heresy, and thus we, as the audience, are left in the dark, and worse off for it. Further down page 39, the author mentions Margaret Fuller's book, Woman in the 19th Century, which is considered by many to be the proto-feminist beginnings of the suffrage movement. This book mentions the need for equality between the sexes and, more importantly, the need for men and women to transcend into higher beings to truly inherit this world. This rings true of the Gnostic beliefs we've talked about before, and they are clearly laid out in Fuller's book. In the following pages, the author documents what can be best described as Margaret Fuller's daddy issues. Fuller apparently disliked her father greatly for his supposed arrogance and elitism. Despite, or perhaps because of this, he insisted on her being educated to a high level. This led Margaret to lament being born of the softer sex. This led her to find solace in transcendentalist ideas of equality and returning humanity to source as one higher being. As the author notes on page 41, a feminist author by the name of Carol Smith-Rosenberg has argued that many of these women in the early proto-feminist movement seem to hold very close relationships with each other, and believes many of them would have been lesbians had they been free to express themselves as such. It is also noted that Fuller's transcendentalist beliefs would go on to inform later scholarship on the issue of gender as a spectrum. My notes here indicate this is in line with the creating heaven on earth Gnostic beliefs of many New Age cults and their age of Aquarius. Remember, we are looking at a heaven on earth after the death of God scenario. If we are all descended from the One, from Source, the Oversoul, Gaia, etc., there is no need for delineation between male and female, because we are all one, and every difference is just a social construct, and can thus be destroyed, so anyone can be anything they want to be. On page 42, the author mentions Fuller and the Fruitlands, founded by Bronson Alcott. Alcott and the Fruitlands was a transcendentalist cult experiment. They had some bizarre views about diet, being vegetarian, which is not unusual by itself, and the drinking of only water, again not inherently bad by itself, but they had ideas about what plants were suitable for eating, choosing only to eat upward-growing plants, rejecting downward-growing plants such as root vegetables. The symbolism here with the concept of ascension, achieving higher planes, etc., is easy enough to see. The Fruitlands was a failure and collapsed after only 7 months. The main reason the author mentions this is because Alcott had a connection to Charles Lane, who also stayed at the Alcott estate. Lane was an English socialist, who had also attempted to create vegetarian socialist communes that failed. Most interestingly was Lane's connection to other socialists, like Robert Owens and James Greaves, who would go on to found Alcott House, named after Bronson Alcott. Alcott House was a vegan socialist utopian commune that practiced spiritualism in the form of astrology, mesmerism, and phrenology. Both the communes of Owens and Greaves would cite women's liberation and thus feminism as key to human transcendence and enlightenment. Later, both Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would cite Robert Owens as inspirations and forerunners to their own ideas. Robert Owens would later in life convert to spiritualism after receiving a psychic reading and would influence the 1800s spiritualism movement. This may explain in part why spiritualism and feminism would become so close over the coming years, as we've discussed before, with many mystics and psychics of the time viewing spiritualism as a means of escaping patriarchal norms and the patriarchal hierarchy of Christianity that was predominant at the time. Chapter 4. The opening of Chapter 4 gives a brief overview of several characters who helped kickstart the spiritualism, mediumship channeler, trance-speaking fad in the mid to late 1800s. Many of those mentioned aren't necessarily feminists or suffragists, but their rhetoric aligns with such later movements. On the topic of this aspect of spiritualism and how it ties to the overall women's rights movement, and how this cannot and must not be ignored, I'm reminded of a quote from the introduction of Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Anne Browd, who wrote, "Taking spiritualism seriously as a religion means that a cadre of female mediums who spread the movement should be seen as religious figures, rather than impressionable dupes. When I embarked on the research that would eventually become Radical Spirits, more than one person asked me whether I really wanted to tar women's rights with the taint of spiritualism. Wouldn't that be bad for the movement? At the time, I viewed these questions as curiously inconsistent with the goals of women's history and religious studies." Shortly after this, there is the reference of Agcha Sprague, one of the best-known spiritualists during the 1850s, and mentioned that here was a woman who travelled widely and received hundreds of letters from admirers who saw her trance lectures and talks as a transformative source of religious teaching. She also viewed her spiritualism as sincere, and viewed her religious teaching as a part of advancing the reform agenda championed by the abolitionists and women's rights conventions that she attended. This melds very nicely with Rachel Wilson's observation in Occult Feminism that trance speakers such as Cora Scott would travel and use the assertion that the voices they used and things they said came from a higher plane. As such, this allowed them to say things that were, perhaps at best, unfashionable, but at worst, dangerous. This, of course, included speeches about suffrage, women's rights, and social justice. All this leads us to the amusing quip that many people may not be so impressed with feminism if they knew that many of the forerunners of their movement were no different from late-night television frauds offering you pay-by-the-minute psychic advice. This leads us on to Victoria Woodhull, a proto-feminist who branded herself by the nickname Mrs. Satan, a woman who many feminists will be quick to remind you was the first woman to ever run for the presidency of the United States of America. Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tennessee, under their maiden name Claflin, formed the main source of income for their family by the fraudulent use of mediumship, clairvoyance, and spiritual healing, leading them to a life on the road to avoid prosecution for scams. This would compound further with Victoria's marriage to one Canning Woodhull, who would also peddle pseudoscientific faith and spiritual cures consisting of snake oil potions and magnets. Later in life, Victoria Woodhull would divorce Canning and become married to one James Blood. During this time, Victoria Woodhull would begin advocating for free love, the same free love that John Noyes advocated that we mentioned earlier. She would expand this concept further and state she considered marriage to be nothing more than state-sanctioned prostitution, and that women only married for material wealth. My note here sarcastically reads, absolutely based. Victoria Woodhull would call her political position based on futurity, devout spiritualism, and transcendental socialism, stating, "My whole nature is prophetic." Her views regarding marriage and sex were considerably ahead of her time, and align with the likes of radical feminist Andrea Dworkin in the all sex that is not female initiated or led is rape manner. By modern standards, Woodall would be considered one of the many flavors of Tumblr sexual, with her writing on the topic, "I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please." Later in life, Victoria would reunite with her sister Tennessee, and together they would have a house on Great Jones Street in New York, where they would meet and have professional and personal relationships with Cornelius Vanderbilt, a rail mogul and one of the wealthiest men to have ever lived. Vanderbilt repeatedly made use of the spiritualist mediums to help predict stock market trends. In exchange for Woodall's help, he would bankroll Woodall, Claflin & Co., the sisters' company and first female-owned trading company on the New York Stock Exchange. As it would turn out, the stock exchange advice the sisters would offer would come from Josie Mansfield, a friend and prostitute who would be visited by many Wall Street bankers, including Jim Fisk, the main rival to Vanderbilt. It would seem their psychic predictions were little more than insider trading pillow talk. It should be noted Josie Mansfield's main claim to fame was having two wealthy lovers, one of whom would murder the other. As a result of this con artistry and fraud, the sisters were able to finance Woodall and Claflin Weekly, a newspaper which was the first publication in the world to carry the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx in English translation. Victoria Woodall would also later become connected with Elizabeth Stanton by publishing rumor and gossip concerning a local Christian minister. Elizabeth Stanton is another interesting character, as she is connected to Susan B. Anthony, with both women contributing to the book The Woman's Bible. This tome is a revision of the Bible written by 26 proto-feminists, with the introduction stating that it aims to revise the Bible that is holding back women and their liberation. That for women to be truly free, Christianity, and therefore everything relating to it, must be destroyed. Wilson then goes on to briefly detail the writers and their various histories. Unsurprisingly, they are generally spiritualists or progressive Christians, and yes, they are Christian despite Wilson's objections, which sadly take up the next few pages and can thus be skipped. The final pages of this chapter relates to Theosophy and Helena Blavatsky and her many travels and Gnostic inspiration for Theosophy. This is not something we really need to cover here because it's been mentioned before, and we'll also cover Theosophy later in reviews of Blavatsky's works. Suffice to say, for people who haven't watched those talks and reviews, Theosophy holds a dualistic belief. Mind and body are separate. We can alter the state of being of the physical by spiritual will. This leads to the New Age concept of vibrations and altering your vibrations to hypothetically achieve a more spiritual level of consciousness, and eventually transcend this plane of existence. How this relates to Gnosticism is because of the acquisition of knowledge that leads to ascension, and then ultimate knowledge in the form of the Akashic Records, which is a book containing all knowledge of everything that is, has been, and ever will be. Transcension to this higher plane will thus turn anyone who achieves it effectively into God. Thus we see the return to God, return to Gaia, return to Monad, return to Oversoul, etc. This turning humanity into a spiritual and thus potentially physically sexless, genderless, raceless being of one. The more interesting part of this final part of Chapter 4 is reference to Per Faxneld, who was a feminist writer who codified the concept of Christianity oppressing women and women's need to rebel against Christianity in the book Satanic Feminism, Lucifer as the Liberator of Women in 19th Century Culture, which I guess is another book added to my reading list. Needless to say, this book posits Lucifer as a liberator of women because of a shared desire to rebel against the Christian God. Chapter 5. The first part of Chapter 5 talks about women's suffrage and its immense lack of popularity, with relevant statistics to back up the observation. These don't need to be covered as we've talked about them before over the years. It also includes examples of anti-suffrage artwork and propaganda, and observes that some of their predictions have come true, such as lowering birth rates. However, here I would once again suggest the impacts of industry and birth control, with feminism being more of another symptom of that underlying truth, with obvious caveats for feedback loops. The more interesting part of this early section of this chapter is the observation that laws for suffrage, along with others, such as gay marriage rights, seem to pass despite being unpopular with the general public at the time, leading on to the next major point of funding. The next few pages become a veritable who's who of people, and can be difficult to track because it's just a long list of names, and will simply bear reading directly because I am terrible with names and people. Perhaps the largest financier of the women's suffrage movement was Alvin Vanderbilt Belmont, born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama in 1853. She was born to a wealthy family. Her mother was the daughter of a U.S. congressman, and her father was a successful commission merchant. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who you may remember from his infamous dealings with Victoria Woodhull. The Vanderbilts were one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the world at the time, and Cornelius not only had an affair with Victoria's sister Tennessee, but he funded the two sisters' newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, which was used to promote their ideas of free love, sex education, legalization of prostitution, vegetarianism, short skirts, women's right to no-fault divorce, and suffrage. Remember, this is in the 1870s, but it's the same exact agenda of the counterculture radicals and second-wave feminists of the 1960s. This is important to note, because as you will see, it has been the same wealthy families pushing this agenda for over a century. It is also important to note that William K. Vanderbilt was a founding member of the Jekyll Island Club, which was where representatives of the richest men in the world met in secret in 1910 to draft legislation to establish central banking in America under the Federal Reserve Act. Alva and William K. Vanderbilt had 3 children together before their divorce due to his infidelities in 1895. At a time when divorce was rare among the elite, Alva was awarded a financial settlement of over $10 million, the equivalent of over $320 million in 2021, as well as several Vanderbilt estates. This made her one of the richest women in the world. 1 year later, she remarried to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, one of her ex-husband's friends. Oliver Belmont was the son of August Belmont, a wealthy Jewish investment banker for the Rothschild family. Oliver was a playboy who had an affinity for absinthe, gambling, and visiting brothels. He was sent to Germany to learn investment banking from the Rothschilds, just as his father, U.S. Congressman Perry Belmont, had. Oliver was married to his first wife Sarah at this time, but his addictions and carousing led to divorce. Oliver was a member of his father's banking firm, member of at least 2 elite secretive societies, the Lambs and the Sons of Revolution, as well as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1900, and a member of Congress from 1901 to 1902. The Lambs is America's oldest theatrical club, founded in 1874, still located adjacent to Rockefeller Center in New York City, and a precursor to the Screen Actors Guild, the institution which now runs Hollywood. The Lambs' membership roster included anyone and everyone of note involved in entertainment at the time, and was an elite, influential social club. The Sons of Revolution is an elite, hereditary fraternal organization started in 1876. The organization states its purpose as historical education and preservation, but requires proof that one is a male who had an ancestor who actively assisted in establishing American independence by his or her acts or counsel between April 19th, 1775 and April 19th, 1783 in military, naval, marine service, by service in the Continental Congress or Congress of any of the 13 colonies, or by service as an official under authority of such bodies, in order to become a member. As such, its membership includes 8 former presidents, including both Bushes, who were also members of the elite Skull and Bones secret society, as well as dozens of high-ranking military officials. Bank of America founder Ora E. Monet, Senator John McCain, Congressman Barry Goldwater, and many others. Oliver Belmont died unexpectedly of appendicitis in 1908, leaving his second wife, Alva, even wealthier than before. I included this brief historical biography of Alva and her husbands in order to demonstrate her connections to the wealthiest elites in the world, their positions of power and influence, where their vast fortunes have come from, and their membership in secret societies. Upon his death, Alva dedicated her life to feminist causes, including suffrage. She donated vast sums of money to women's suffrage organizations in both the UK and the US. She frequently paid the bail of picketers and demonstrators in the suffrage movement, and she funded and organized large rallies and marches. She founded the Political Equality League in 1909 to help gain votes for suffrage-supporting candidates in New York. She purchased office space for the National American Woman Suffrage Association and funded its National Press Bureau. She convened a Conference of Great Women in 1914 at Marble House, one of her sprawling estates. She organized huge fundraisers attended by her wealthy elite New York friends, and is regarded by historians to be likely the largest single contributor to the financial success of the suffrage movement. Returning to the write-up, we must also talk about Phoebe Hearst, who married into the wealth of George Hearst. Upon the death of her husband, Phoebe Hearst came into a fortune of millions and became a benefactor of the University of Berkeley, California, and investor in Greenacre Inn, a cross-religious facility. Phoebe Hearst would proclaim herself a follower of the Baha'i faith, a faith that believes that there is one God and that their religion is built through manifestations of God, who are the various founders of the faith. The three teachings of Baha'i are unity of God, unity of religion, and unity of humanity. These principles sound much as they are: one people, one faith, one God, all around the world. All people becoming as one. Phoebe Hearst would contribute large sums of money to suffrage campaigns, including the 1916 Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage Convention, where the National Women's Party was founded. All this taken together begins to indicate that feminism was never a grassroots movement. It has always been funded by a small number of wealthy, influential people. We see the same thing today, with numerous feminist activists coming from rich families out of expensive higher education institutes. Chapter 6. This chapter introduces us to Theosophy, something we've mentioned before and will cover in coming write-ups. Here, however, I would like to address something from Rachel Wilson's perspective. This seems to be something that others, usually in the area of traditional conservative politics, observe as well. In this chapter, she points out that Theosophy offered a rejection of the patriarchy of Christianity. This in itself plays into a feminist ideal of society, at some point having been a patriarchy. This objection may come as to how the term patriarchy is used, but society was never patriarchal. For religious and right-wing types to use this term to refer to societal order inherently submits to feminist dogma. Even in times where official authority rested with men, there was still ample female power in society. The men who ruled would often only do so with the blessing of enough of that society's women. Continuing with the book, we learn of Mabel Collins, an adept of Blavatsky, who co-authored with her a journal titled Lucifer, which contained many articles on the esoteric, occult, Kabbalism, astrology, and feminism. After a falling out between the two, Collins would suggest Blavatsky had begged her to state her writing was divinely written by Blavatsky's spirit mentors. In return, Blavatsky accused Collins of having numerous affairs with members of her order and practicing sexual tantric black magic. My note here, it's fascinating that such modern, progressive, sex-positive, free-love women would resort to calling each other slut. How things never change. As a result of this dispute, Collins withdrew from public life due to a mental breakdown. She and her 46 books are lauded by feminists to this day. We are next introduced to Florence Farr, New Age woman extraordinaire, a West End actress in London who had numerous affairs, including with George Bernard Shaw and W.B. Yeats. Yeats should be noted as a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which he initiated Farr into in 1890. Farr climbed high in the ranks of the Golden Dawn because of her alleged ability to summon the Egyptian god Tapthartarath. Farr would leave the Golden Dawn in 1902 and write numerous articles on women's liberation and ancient Egyptian religion in the journal The New Age. In 1907, she would write about how prostitution should not only be legal, but be seen as sacred. Most interestingly, the author of this book notes her stance as being anti-Christian, but doesn't comment on Farr's position, including the possible interpretation that Christianity is anti-white. Next, the author mentions Annie Besant, who we may have mentioned before as one of Helena Blavatsky's protégés. Besant had a poor relationship with her husband, who was an Anglican vicar, while she was Catholic. This theological difference resulted in problems for their marriage. Besant would take to writing books and articles which earned her a modest sum. She would come to be unhappy with her husband having control of the family finances, with her belief being that her money should be hers and his should belong to the family, read hers by proxy. This is interesting in light of what was written by Anne Wilson Schaef in Women's Reality, claiming women just know what is theirs in relationships and never overreach for money or property in the event of divorce. Besant did, of course, divorce her husband and would work writing for the National Secular Society in England, covering topics such as birth control, secularism, socialism, and feminism. Shortly after this would be her meeting with Helena Blavatsky and eventual conversion to Theosophy, after which she would serve as co-editor for the magazine Lucifer. After numerous trips to India, which she believed to be her true home, she would also join the International Order of Freemasonry for Men and Women, Le Droit Humain, seeing it as a natural extension of her occult beliefs. Besant also had a friend, C.W. Leadbetter, who was removed from the Theosophy Society after teaching its pubertal male members about masturbation and committing sex acts with them. Besant remained friends with Leadbetter despite this, which is important because in later years, Leadbetter would find Jiddu Krishnamurti, a 12-year-old boy that he believed would be a world teacher and vehicle for the spirit of Lord Maitreya, who would help evolve humanity into a higher being. Besant adopted the boy and, together with Leadbetter, began grooming him for his new spiritual role. The term grooming there is used deliberately to reference more than one context, with Krishnamurti later in life, after becoming disillusioned with Theosophy, describing Leadbetter as simply evil and refusing to discuss the topic further. However, during the time Krishnamurti was being groomed for his future, Besant and Leadbetter would found a publishing company, the Star Publishing Trust. On page 77 we are introduced to Alice Bailey, a woman frequently referred to as the mother of the New Age movement. Like many others, Bailey has a lengthy history including divorce and discovery of Theosophy. She and her second husband, a Freemason and National Secretary of the Theosophy Society by the name of Foster Bailey, would go on to found the Lucifer Publishing Company, which would go on to be renamed as the Lucis Publishing Company to avoid confusion with the journal Lucifer. Bailey was a prolific writer, creating 24 books that she claims were written with spiritually channeled guidance. These books are not feminist in the strictest sense, but are more focused on the occult and New Age spiritualism. Several of her books mention the need for a one-world government, one-world religion, etc. It was this belief of hers, as exemplified in her book Esoteric Astrology, this is my note here, not from Occult Feminism, in which Bailey wrote, "Arguing as one ever must from the universal to the particular, it is essential that humanity relates its own mechanism to the greater mechanism through which the planetary life functions, and views his soul as an infinitesimal part of the world soul. It is necessary for him, therefore, to relate his soul to his personality, viewing both as aspects and integral parts of the human family. This will be increasingly the case. This process is beginning to demonstrate in the steadily expanding group, national, and racial consciousness which humanity is today demonstrating, a consciousness which shows a spiritual inclusiveness, or as an abnormal and wicked attempt, from the standpoint of the soul, to fuse and blend all nations into a world order based on material issues and dominated by a material vision. Notice the use of the term world soul, and remember back to conversations concerning Hegel and the concept of Weltgeist. You can see the through line from Hegel's sublation of the dialectic, and how the spirit is the animating principle of the transformation, the becoming, of the dialectic. You should also notice the concept of racial consciousness, and how this ties into modern intersectionalist feminist conversations and framing around the topic of critical race theory, and the need for people to raise racial consciousness, which once again ties back to Hegel and the Volksgeist, which, from a Hegel dictionary by Inward, Hegel held represented national peculiarity and the primitive or primordial of a people. That a people has a distinctive character or spirit, in part inherent to them, but also in part due to historical circumstance and natural environment. Covering some previous conversation and presentation, this is why critical race theorists and other feminists, intersectionalists, gender scholars, etc., will have capital B black or capital T trans identities. They believe in an inherent similarity to these people, by virtue of being, and also by shared environments and historical circumstance. This may go on to explain how you get some people making silly observations such as being racist towards Muslims. Muslim is, of course, a name given to the followers of Islam, not a race, as in an observable genetic admixture of allele frequencies. However, under the framework of Hegelian Volksgeist, a race can be, in effect, created by enough shared historical circumstance and environment, leading to a shared spirit. Or the racist towards Muslims is just an assertion because most Muslims are brown, and they think you just hate brown people and use Islam as a proxy. Once again, inner circle versus outer circle understanding. Returning back to the book, it was this belief of Bailey's that would influence her later decision to become involved with the United Nations, and her founding of the United Nations non-government organization, UN Goodwill, and may have been influential in the Spiritual Caucus at the United Nations, which is a real thing even though it might sound like it's not. You can read about the UN Spiritual Caucus at spiritualcaucusun.org. This website contains links to everything you'd expect: the Global Eco Village Project, Gaia Education, Operation Peace Through Unity, the Cosmos Associates. It's all the standard New Age hippy-dippy sort of organizations, the kind that continue to exist despite being run by seemingly perpetually broke hippies. This is because they're being funded by the UN. Unfortunately, this belief of Bailey's and her influence over these organizations have given rise to actual conspiracy theories about the New World Order, which do posit things that are untrue, such as the use of NASA technology to influence people and usher in the New Age. However, there is obvious truth to the idea that the United Nations does push for greater globalization efforts, freer exchange of ideas, movement of people, trade, etc., and the UN is influential in informing government policy and economic projects via its various NGOs. These are literally described on their various websites and pamphlets. It is not a conspiracy theory to suggest that organizations do the things they are telling you they are doing. Unfortunately, the end of Chapter 6 concludes with the author reminding us yet again that she is an Orthodox Christian, quoting Bible verses and speculating that the likes of Bailey and her psychic writing are actually informed by the devil or demonic possession, and thus can be safely skipped. Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, the author begins to talk about the early 1900s, the change in fashions in the early 1920s, the early impacts of the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of widespread acceptance of the theory of evolution, natural selection, and its attendant subsciences of Malthusian thinking and eugenics. This is mentioned in very brief, but is ultimately fine. After this brief overview, we are introduced to Margaret Sanger, founder of the US's Planned Parenthood organization. Wilson indicates Margaret Sanger's mother is propagandized as being killed by giving birth to too many children, and this led to Sanger's later desire for safe, legal abortion and contraception. Wilson clarifies this as being mostly untrue, since Sanger's mother suffered from tuberculosis. This appears to be more true than the death as a result of too many children that is pushed today. However, with not much medical information, I can't confirm one way or another, although it does seem more likely that the tuberculosis would have been more likely to be fatal. Sanger's activism started in 1911, when she joined the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party. She would write pro-abortion propaganda for the socialist magazine, The New York Call. During this time, she would make reference to cases of women she had been tending to suffering ill side effects as a result of self-induced abortions, and anecdotes of women being denied abortions and killed as a result of negligent, skeptical, or outright sadistic male doctors. A biographer, Ellen Chasler, attempted to verify these anecdotes and found no evidence supporting the existence of such cases or women. It does in fact appear to be accepted amongst Sanger biographers and historians that these claims are falsified for reasons of propaganda. This is of course not widely publicized and would appear to be one of feminism's more dirty secrets, that their abortion rhetoric is founded upon lies. Wilson goes on to indicate that, despite the back-alley abortion trope, before abortion was legalized in 1973, 90% of all abortions were carried out by healthcare providers in the form of physicians or midwives. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, co-founder of the National Abortion Right Legislation League, has gone on to admit that an oft-cited 10,000 women die every year as a result of illegal abortions was a forgery and only used because it was a useful PR tactic. Planned Parenthood has also admitted that abortion record keeping is accurate, and for one example, there were only 29 deaths from illegal abortions in 1972. Another interesting fact thrown in here by Wilson is that in Finland, 94% of maternal death related to abortion were not identified as such on death certificates. This is not only interesting because there is obviously concerted global effort to keep abortion risk numbers down to push the procedure even harder, but it is also interesting because there have been other allegations of impropriety on death certificates regarding COVID-19, so as to influence the total numbers of deaths for reasons of propaganda. In 1913, Sanger would become estranged from her husband, and in 1914 flee the USA for Europe, after she was accused of violating postal obscenity laws for sending copies of the publication The Woman Rebel, which contained graphic information about contraception via the mail. She would leave behind not only her husband, but her 3 children. While in Europe, Sanger would, very predictably after what we've heard about all the other feminists of their time, have affairs with multiple partners. She would return to the States only after her estranged husband was arrested for distributing pamphlets she had written, though she would not visit him in jail, citing annoyance that he had become involved in her work. Shortly before this return, with her husband in jail, her children would be sent to a boarding school where her daughter Peggy would die of pneumonia. This signaled the end of Sanger's relationship with her husband, with the marriage being annulled in 1921. After this, Sanger would, by introduction of one of her lovers, the sexologist Havelock Ellis, begin to dabble in Rosicrucianism in an attempt to channel and be reunited with the spirit of her deceased daughter. Havelock Ellis would go on to marry a lesbian feminist woman, Edith Lees, with whom he would have an open relationship. Ellis allegedly suffered from lifelong impotence and discovered at the age of 60 that the only reliable cure for this condition was watching women urinate. He would, through his life, also advocate that homosexuality was a natural, harmless quirk. He would also co-author the book Sexual Inversion with John Addington Symonds, a noted proponent of homosexuality and pederasty. John Simmons, much like Havelock Ellis, would be married to a woman but have homosexual affairs with men. Havelock Ellis would, through his life, study what would now be called transgenderism, which he referred to as Aeonism. Havelock Ellis would also publish a book, Psychology of Sex, in which he would talk about the masturbation practices of children as young as 3, and claim children were, quote, capable of a wide range of genital and sexual aptitude, end quote. This is your daily reminder that progressives have been pushing the sex with children thing for over a century, and this is not some the left has only just now gone too far thing. To top off this list of degeneracies, he was also a eugenicist, although we should remember this was not uncommon at the time because of the new science of evolution and heritability. Returning to Margaret Sanger on page 91, we are introduced to another of her husbands, James Noah Slee, a wealthy businessman who would become the first manufacturer of diaphragm contraceptives. In 1923, Sanger would procure funding from John Rockefeller Jr. to open the Clinical Research Bureau, which eventually opened as Planned Parenthood. It should be noted here, Rockefeller is also the brain behind an interdenominational church, the Riverside Church, which aimed at blending numerous religions into one faith. A note here from myself, interdenominational can sometimes be replaced with the term transdenominational. This is important, because the concept of transdenomination is found in Rosicrucianism, which aims for the one-world religion through reunification with God on earth as it stands now. This is covered in the Rosicrucian concept of Prisca Theologia. This bears some further explanation, so I will read a short excerpt from Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by Glenn Alexander McGee, Chapter 2. The Second Rosicrucian Manifesto, Confessio Fraternitatis, appeared in 1615. The third and most famous Rosicrucian work, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, an allegorical prose poem laden with alchemical imagery, appeared in 1616. The principal author of these works, and perhaps the inventor of Rosicrucianism, seems to have been Johann Valentin Andrea, 1586 to 1654, a native of Württemberg. Andrea's father was a clergyman and practicing alchemist. Johann Valentin's mother was later court apothecary to the Duke. His grandfather, Jacob Andrea, had a hand in drafting the Formula of Concord of 1580, which aimed at unifying Lutherans and Calvinists. It was Jacob who created the Andrea family coat of arms, a St. Andrew's cross with 4 roses. Johann Valentin was trained as a pastor at the Tübingen Stift, but was expelled following a political scandal. According to Heinrich Schneider, the Rosicrucians declared that unification with God was demonstrable and possible already on earth. For that demonstration, they were leaning upon a modification of enlightened natural philosophy, which upheld that nature, in its teleological structure, was a gradual revelation of God. Given that Boehmer's first work was not even written until 1612, it is not plausible that he influenced the Rosicrucians. Rather, it is more likely that the Rosicrucian movement influenced Boehmer. Schneider also suggested that Boehmer took up the Rosicrucian Pansophy and the reformatory plans connected with it. Andrew Weeks notes that Boehmer incorporated 2 Rosicrucian slogans into his writing, the Age of the Roses and the New Reformation. The Rosicrucian movement involved members of many different religious denominations. The Rosicrucians held a doctrine of Princeps Theologia, the position that there is one true trans-denominational, transcultural theology, an account of divine being revealed by God to man in the remote past. They believed that if this ancient wisdom could be recovered, it would unify the world's religion. 2 images are associated with Rosicrucianism, owing to the ambiguity of the German Rosenkreuz, the Red Cross, and the cross with roses, usually blooming from the center. The meaning of these images has provoked much speculation. The Rosicrucians were supposed to adopt the dress and manners of the different lands in which they travelled, a fact which Julius Evola takes as symbolic of the belief of Principia Theologia, or Philosophia Perennis. Antony Favre offers the following list of important authors who helped disseminate Rosicrucian ideals: Robert Flood, 1574 to 1637, Julius Sperber, unknown to 1619, Elias Ashmole, 1617 to 1692, Michael Mayer, circa 1566 to 1622, Samuel Hartlib, 1595 to 1662, Jan Amos Comenius, 1592 to 1670, John Hayden, The Holy Guide, 1662, and Theophilus Schweiart, Speculum Sophicum Rhodo Storicum, 1618. The Rosicrucian manifestos captured the imagination of scores of intellectuals throughout Europe, many of whom desperately tried to make contact with the order to join their ranks. Descartes and Bacon were two such seekers. Some, like Robert Flood, even wrote their own Rosicrucian works, in hopes of earning the favour of the order. Eventually, Andrea became disgusted with the furore he had created and sought to distance himself from those who were now calling themselves Rosicrucians. In 1916, Andrea published Christianopolis, which called for a new reformation. There was no longer any talk of Rosicrucians, but as Francis Yates puts it, a rose by any other name. Returning to the write-up, for the record here, various Rockefellers and their organizations, when spoken about, seem to instantly garner dismissal as conspiracy theories. We find this quite a lot these days when talking about investment firms and large charitable and/or philanthropic organizations. Things like the Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, BlackRock, Vanguard, etc. To briefly address this, it is not a conspiracy theory to suggest that investment firms invest in things, and that philanthropic organizations give money to things. If you think this is a conspiracy theory, I would ask you, what exactly is it that you think investment firms do, if not investing in things, and charities and philanthropes do, if not giving money and resources to things? The final players on the stage of this chapter are Gregory Pincus, a man who, with Sanger, helped develop the first birth control pill. This was done with the help of wealthy friend and feminist Catherine McCormick, a woman who came into vast sums of money after her husband, Stanley McCormick, was diagnosed by one Emil Kraepelin as having schizophrenia. Thus, Catherine McCormick came into part control of his finances and estate. This was until his death in 1947, after which Catherine inherited $35 million and proceeded to bankroll Sanger and Pincus's contraceptive pill. The remainder of Chapter 7 details Sanger's apparent dislike, if not outright hatred, of mothers and children. The author also relates several anecdotes about being insulted by feminists for having numerous children herself, noting the use of similar derogatory terms, such as breeder and baby factory. She then goes on to note the crashing birth rates that are happening around the world in the last few decades. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins with talking about English occultist Aleister Crowley, founder of Thelema, a spiritualist practice that worships the Scarlet Woman Babylon, the sacred whore. Crowley was heavily inspired by the works of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which he was a member of before moving on to found Thelema. Consistent with Hermetic and Theosophical beliefs, Thelema drew heavily on ancient Egyptian religious icons. In this instance, the belief that Babylon must become incarnated as a means of overthrowing the patriarchal god Osiris to usher in the Age of Horus. Crowley believed that he would be the beast that the Scarlet Woman must ride in upon to enter the world, which predictably led him to the practice of sex magic. Crowley had numerous followers, but there are two names that stick out as famous people you may know: L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a NASA scientist who would eventually die working on jet propulsion. However, during his life, he would meet a woman named Marjorie Cameron, whom he considered to be the embodiment of the modern occult feminist woman. Parsons had planned on using her to conceive a child he thought would represent the Antichrist. However, Marjorie would abort a pregnancy without telling Parsons. Although the two were married in the same year that they met, both would continue having affairs. After Parsons' untimely death, Marjorie Cameron would move to California and set up an occult society that would practice ritual sex magic as a means of incarnating so-called moon children and to contact the spirit of her late husband. The author misses out some key details about Cameron, which I will provide here. These rituals would include self-harm and the alleged presence of UFOs as a sign of the effectiveness of these rituals. Cameron would also hold catastrophic views of the end of the world, brought about by a race war from which she believed she would be rescued by a flying saucer. The UFO link here will become relevant shortly. Moon children are supposedly spiritually attuned children aligned with the moon, which is the female heavenly body compared to the male sun. This is where we can talk about the importance of the solar and lunar traditions and cycles from antiquity. This is covered in extensive detail in the writings of Evola, whom I've spoken about before over the years, as well as mentioning the storytelling methods of the Olympian and Titanic cycles, which I've mentioned before but not covered in extensive detail. This is something that may be done in the future, but this is not the time or place. The importance of the lunar tradition and lunar cycle is that it is a weaker reflection of the solar masculine cycle. The solar representing a pole of strength, stability, centrality, and a spiritual core dominated by masculine principles. The lunar representing feminine principles, meekness, chaos, and materialism. This is part of where the female spiritualism moon connection hails from. You can read more about these things in The Mystery of the Grail and Revolt Against the Modern World. To this, I would like to add in the New Age concepts of star seeds and indigo children, which the author does not mention, but I think bears some explanation because of the similarity in concept and the importance they hold for L. Ron Hubbard and his UFO alien-based faith of Scientology. Indigo children are a New Age child that is more spiritually aware and in tune than normal people, and manifest psychic abilities such as telepathy. The concept of indigo children was created by Nancy Ann Tapp and formalized in her book, Life Through Color, which is a New Age tome mentioning auras and their colors and the significance of these colors, hence indigo children. Starseeds are a New Age belief that some people are actually aliens, either by birth or by having an alien spirit attached to them during an out-of-body experience. Starseeds are usually considered teachers who will claim to be passing on alien knowledge to people via telepathy, out-of-body experiences, and channeled writing. The concepts of indigo children and starseeds are important to the New Age religion because it is a means of indoctrination. You don't find out you're one of them unless someone already in the cult tells you you are one. It is the lure into the New Age faith. You're probably realizing the connections to Scientology here, and the Gnostic portions of hidden knowledge and understanding. The Scientology angle is the concept of the alien Xenu and his destruction of a planet, resulting in Thetons flying to Earth and attaching themselves to people. Of course, you need to join Scientology and give them all your money and possessions to clear these Thetons, so that you can become a fully spiritually realized person. While we talk about this, remember our last book, Women's Reality, and the dualism mentioned, the ongoing forever process and levels of capital T truth. There is a direct through line in all of these topics stemming from the Gnostic tradition, radiating out via Hermetica and Theosophy. This is why feminism is so heavily entwined with the New Age movement, neo-paganism, and witchcraft. The spiritually centered divine female channeling their gnosis, their hidden knowledge, to tell you the real her story of the world, to overthrow the patriarchal so-called objective world, to help people realize the capital T truth of the divine feminine, so we can engage in the process of becoming to free ourselves from the oppressive material world by becoming enlightened, changing our vibrational frequencies, ushering in the new age and becoming one with God, with Source, the Oversoul, etc. All enabled by allowing that female system free-flowing exchange of energy from solar plexus to solar plexus, so that we can destroy oppressive white male so-called objective social constructs and objective defined categories such as race and gender, and transcend to become one, free of all distinction and difference, as part of the one truth of itself. A quick reminder here, this is literally quoting university course level women's studies literature. Going back to the book, Marjorie Cameron would later become an influential character in the Hollywood scene and a counterculture icon, contributing to many pieces of work promoting witchcraft and occult themes in Hollywood productions. The author then takes a break from the occult to mention Simone de Beauvoir, a secular atheist intellectual. Certainly an important figure to the movement, but not someone tied to the occult practices of feminism directly. However, the most crucial connection mentioned is de Beauvoir's belief concerning children and family. She was an open advocate for a Marxist socialist communal raising of children away from the nuclear family, and most famously said that the nuclear family should not be an option for women, because if it is an option, then too many women will make that choice. The author fails to mention here, but it bears pointing out, the anti-family, anti-children approach is consistent with the spiritual practices we've mentioned before, regarding anchoring people to the material and thus preventing spiritual ascension. The closest we get to this from the author is mentioning that de Beauvoir considered women's liberation impossible if nuclear families exist. I would, however, posit here that women's liberation is a spiritualist term, as outlined in previous works. On page 103, we are introduced to Betty Friedan, feminist intellectual and Marxist, and author behind the famous feminist book, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan's focus was more on the concept of liberating the everyday woman from the shackles of housework and stay-at-home motherdom. This side of her feminist activism took precedence, and thus she focused less on sexual liberation, and perceived movements such as radical political lesbianism as an alienating factor for normal women. This focus on domesticity may have been one of the key factors in making her work, and thus the bored, lonely, neglected, unfulfilled housewife trope so popular. This would have only been helped by Friedan gaining more public attention and fame by becoming the first president of the National Organization for Women. Later in her career, she would come to face a strong ideological opponent in the form of Gloria Steinem, who the author introduces us to next. Friedan would be vocally critical of Steinem for numerous reasons. Firstly, her support of radical and political lesbianism, and secondly, the hypocritical fact that Steinem herself would frequently, in private, be dating men in New York's upper social echelons. These attacks would come to a notable high with Friedan and the feminist Red Stocking organization accusing Gloria Steinem of being a CIA plant. The author of the book goes on to allege that this accusation may have some merit, noting oddities in Steinem's career, such as receiving the CIA-created Chester Bowles Fellowship, which allowed her to study abroad in India for 2 years. This fellowship seems to have never been granted to any other person. The author alleges that this may be a fund to cover Steinem working for the CIA in India, as during her time there she met with many influential organizations, such as Gandhian independence activists and radical communists. It is also curious to note the role that India played in forming the works of notable theosophists, such as Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and Annie Besant, all of whom we've mentioned before, and A.P. Sinnett, author of Revised Theosophical Text esoteric Buddhism. Upon returning from India, Steinem would travel to Europe with the National Student Association under the Congress for Cultural Freedom Group, which was a CIA-controlled anti-communist Cold War propaganda outfit. This was exposed as part of a widespread campaign known as Operation Mockingbird. It appears as though feminism was a part of a larger campaign to liberalize Western nations. Indeed, as the author notes, British historian Francis Stonner Saunders wrote in 1999, "Whether they liked it or not, whether they knew it or not, there were few writers, poets, artists, historians, scientists, or critics in post-war Europe whose names were not in some way linked to this covert enterprise," referring to the Congress for Cultural Freedom Group. The author details a few names and publications related to this enterprise, including The Washington Post and Miss Magazine, a magazine founded by Gloria Steinem and CIA employee Clay Felker. The author notes that given Steinem's connection to India and coincidence of theosophical implication, the first issue of Miss Magazine featuring an image of Goddess Kali would appear to make a lot more sense. Of note, the author also introduces another Steinem-influenced feminist group, Cell 16, the founder of whom would be Abby Rockefeller, daughter of previously mentioned David Rockefeller. Cell 16 would, rather interestingly, promote celibacy, and as described by cultural historian Alice Eccles, feminist heterosexual separatism, noting the group never advocated lesbianism as a political strategy. This is sadly a fact the author doesn't mention, instead focusing on the general trend in the 1970s towards political lesbianism and the destruction of heteronormalcy. While this omission isn't a lie, I do think it's important to point out, as going from Cell 16 immediately to the wider trend of political lesbianism may give people the wrong idea about the group. From page 107, the author returns to Betty Friedan and her Humanist Manifesto 2, mentioning the anti-religious nature of Friedan and her ideas, and confirms birth control, divorce, and abortion as human rights elements, and notes this ties rather well with the previously mentioned goals of the Rockefeller Foundation advocacy and the goals stated by the United Nations. On page 107, the author also engages in one of my pet peeves, and that is referring to organizations such as the UN as being technocratic in nature. Many people do this in online discourse, especially self-professed right-leaning sources. However, organizations such as the United Nations, World Economic Forum, etc. are not technocratic, they are bureaucratic. Technocracy at its core indicates that governing should be carried out by people with express areas of expertise in whatever field they are overseeing. Agricultural policy overseen by farmers for but one example. This is not how the UN or aligned NGOs such as the World Economic Forum work. They are absolute bureaucracies, career politicians and activists pushing their own agendas with little care for what workers or industry leaders in their respective fields think. See their reaction to things such as the farmers' protests. Under technocracy, the farmers would be listened to, because their area of expertise is the field that is being governed. This did not happen because these organizations are not technocratic in the strict definition. Unfortunately, the term has been expanded in recent years to include bureaucracies influenced by technologists, which you would think would be the same thing. However, a technologist is simply an IT specialist using communication technology to examine and enhance the relationship between government and people. This misuse of the term annoys me because I find the idea of actual proper technocracy to be thoroughly interesting and would like to see more genuinely technocratic elements work their way into government, if we are to have a government at all, that is. It should be noted here that if you go to online technocratic resources, such as technocracy.news, you will find extensive articles decrying the actions of organizations such as the UN, EU, WEF, etc., and their many stated goals, such as the Sustainable Living Goals, Donut Economics, Degrowth Strategies, 15-minute cities, etc. Once again, this points to the fact that these organizations are not technocratic in nature, as many online self-identified technocrats greatly dislike these organizations and their designs on the world. However, to avoid derailing this into a no true Scotsman talk, let's return to the book. This chapter then rounds out by noting the anti-religious nature of feminism being thoroughly misleading, given its clear, still present occult beliefs and imagery, noting that as little as 40 years ago, these occult roots were on full display for all to see. Remember once again the constant talk of metaphysics, dualities, the solar plexus hole in need of healing, flow of energies, and void of female sin from women's reality. All New Age woo being openly discussed in a university reading listed women's studies book published in 1982. Chapter 9. The author opens this chapter by noting the interesting connections between the large government backing of feminism and New Ageism, and goes on to mention the CIA experimenting with psychoactive drugs in the form of LSD under the MK Project. For people who still somehow believe that MK is a conspiracy theory, it is not. MK was revealed in 1975 by the Birch Committee of the United States Congress. A Freedom of Information request in 1977 uncovered 20,000 documents relating to MK. This revelation led to Senate hearings and the final declassification of all material concerning MK, which happened in 2001. MK was real, and it happened. This should not be a surprise. From the beginning of World War II, there were attempts by numerous nations around the world to use technology and pharmaceuticals to induce compliance and outright mind control in people. The Soviet Union developed the Sapan device, a mechanical frequency storage unit that attempted to control minds, or at the very least influence behavior via high-frequency wave generation. In fact, a 2013 paper by Kernbach demonstrates numerous Soviet operations aiming to do basically the same thing America was doing with MK. MI6 in the UK had similar LSD experiments in the 1950s. There's also the well-known history of early forms of methamphetamines in Nazi Germany. These sorts of experiments were routine around the world, so MK, far from being an outlandish conspiracy theory, is actually really quite mundane and by the numbers for government and military research of the era. The author then goes on to mention Terence McKenna and his experimentation with psychoactive compounds, and his combination of goddess-worshipping, New Age spirituality, and the technological singularity. Unfortunately, the author leads this by stating McKenna may have had ties with the CIA. This is not something I've been able to verify and seems to be conjecture. The author mentions again the loose ties between neo-paganism, psychoactive drugs, New Ageism, and unfortunately this part is tenuous and relies on McKenna being in some way connected to the CIA, for which there appears to be no proof. I'm not ruling it out as an absolute, but digging around the place I have found nothing concrete. Both McKenna and the CIA have interesting histories, we don't need to invent them. On page 111, the author introduces us to Helen Diner, a feminist and member of the Theosophical Society Adya, a woman who, later in life, in typical feminist pattern, abandoned her husband and children to travel to the Middle East. Her life's work include the writing of the book Mothers and Amazons, a book based on the work of Johann Bachofen. Bachofen is a writer and anthropologist who popularized the theory of the matriarchal religion, suggesting that ancient human societies were female-led goddess worshippers, and, most controversially, suggested that humans were non-monogamous and instead reproduced orgiastically under the light of a full moon. This claim has no basis in reality and has been discredited on numerous occasions. However, this does not stop feminists from repeating this lie in the modern era. In fact, this lie is so prevalent it has formed part of the feminist justification for fathers having no rights over children, as they believe that society should trace lineage by matriarchy. These occult Amazonian beliefs and bizarre moon ritual orgies sadly took on in certain spheres of feminist-aligned occult groups, and gives us the more bizarre outcrops of triple-aspect goddess worship and modern Dianic Wiccan cults. Unfortunately, this is where the author begins to touch back into satanic panic territory, claiming that these neo-pagan beliefs share a satanic element shared with Protestantism because of focus on individualism, and backs this up with assertions about the horned god of paganism being linked to Satanism. Neo-paganism, and Wicca in particular, may be a mishmash of terrible misunderstanding. This is something the author could have cleared up but didn't because of her orthodox bias, so I will do it for you. Horned deities predate Christianity and the concept of Satan by many millennia. The horns, often portrayed as antlers, represent a dualistic god and his two aspects. In the UK, this can be tied to the concept of the Green Man and legends of the Oak and Holly King, a representation of the endless battle of the seasons. This same theme is witnessed throughout many folklore tales, such as Gwyn and Gwythyr, the Arthurian legend of Gwyn ap Nudd, who prevents his sister Craithlad from marrying Gwythyr ap Gradle. In retaliation for this, a war breaks out between the two, with Arthur stepping in to negotiate that each May Day the two shall fight for Craithlad. The point of May Day should be obvious, since it's a traditional festival between the spring equinox and summer solstice, and marks the change in seasons. There are obvious ties here to the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, the Green Knight entering Arthur's halls bearing an axe and a holly branch, challenging Gawain to behead him on condition the Green Knight may do the same to Gawain next year. There's obvious connections to Cernunnos, a deity whose function is poorly understood, but seems to represent nature, fertility, the underworld, and reincarnation. The underworld connection with a horned god is where Christians misstep, and show their lack of understanding of old pagan beliefs, in assuming the underworld is hell in the Christian concept. It is not. The underworld, hell, spelled with only one L, is a resting place, underground because of the tradition of burying the dead in burial mounds where they await reincarnation. It is not a place of condemnation and torment. It is frequently described as cool and a peaceful place, with some sources even indicating people there enjoy farming by day and celebrations at night. As stated, this desire to paint a horned or dual-aspect god as satanic is merely Christian propaganda, and frankly no worse than the awful misinterpretations and misrepresentations of neo-pagans. Unfortunately, the author continues with this horrendous misunderstanding and misattribution to talk about Satanists and the Church of Satan, and how they supported the Texas Heartbeat Bill, the author's very obvious bias slipping in once again. Fortunately, the author then, on page 113, returns to talking about things that are correct, in the form of the Wiccan Susan B. Anthony Coven No. 1, a female-exclusive Dianic cult of goddess worship, which is very popular amongst feminists who consider themselves to be witches. The author mentions this has caused fracturing in the feminist movement because of its trans-exclusionary nature. Unfortunately, she then goes on to call this the result of removing the moral foundation of society, and bemoans the existence of gay marriage and transgenderism as being a march towards transhumanism and the destruction of all boundaries. This is true, as we've discussed regarding immanentism and the end of history after the death of God. However, the obvious insinuation here from the author, that is made explicit in the final chapter of this book, being, if you just accept Jesus, become orthodox and agree with everything the author says, then ideas the author doesn't like will magically go away. The author goes on to mention the radical feminist Shulamith Firestone, a woman who, in her book The Dialectic of Sex, bemoans women having to get pregnant and give birth, citing that in the future this will be handled with technology and result in the abolition of nuclear families, favouring communal child-rearing. Expanding on what the author has said, Firestone was open in being more radical than Marx and Engels in her beliefs that every level of societal inequality stems from biological division of labour. This is the reason for her wishing to destroy the nuclear family. The author, unfortunately lacking this expansion, misses a crucial fact about Firestone and her beliefs. Firestone was of the opinion that women and children are oppressed in the family because of division in biology. This is crucial to understanding the modern leftist argument for positions such as lowering the age of sexual consent, which has been stated as being inevitable under a socialist system because of a more even distribution of power. As has been written of her writings, the socialist feminist revolution will free both women and children, leaving them with complete economic independence and sexual freedom, and integrating them fully into the larger world. Unfortunately, the author neglects this point completely and instead chooses to focus on how artificial wombs serves as a means of attacking Christianity by undermining the family unit. Chapter 10. Unfortunately, the final chapter is ultimately a disappointment. It lists the objective facts of lowering birth rates in Western nations and the rise of single motherhood as the norm, increasing rates of parental alienation, rising rates of daycare usage, and plummeting rates of female happiness, combined with the "you go girl" social media-induced destruction of the dating market, wherein all women are queens and deserve only the top 1% of men, and the dangers of no-fault divorce. Sadly, the author rounds these verifiable facts off with a call to Jesus, stating that the Orthodox Church is the true way all of this bad stuff goes away. This is simply not true. As laid out previously, Christian morality was founded on a plurality of pagan morals, but made into a weak form of slave morality. This combined with the Industrial Revolution and changes in lifestyle, we're merely seeing the human animal laid bare in its new environment. No amount of appealing to the Christ God will change the fact that we are here because of that belief system, not in spite of it. No amount of Jesus talk will change human nature. That includes the oft-ignored important female nature that this environment has allowed everyone to see. Unfortunately, most, both men and women, will deny this nature and its impacts, the author of this book included. Thank you for listening to this review and note-taking on Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation by Rachel Wilson. Hopefully it has been as much use and interest to you as it has been to me, and my own research in this ongoing project of demonstrating feminism's religious underpinnings. Next on the list is Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America by Anne Browd. Thank you for listening, and I shall see you next time.